So we're in your government book. We're in chapter 6, and we're talking about the executive branch, which is the presidency. And I went over all of the presidents. In the last page here, I'll show you. We just went over all these presidents right here. And you can see their vice presidents. I won't go over them again, but it's good to know and memorize that group. We're all the way down to the 46th president of the United States, which is Biden today. So, and then I wanted to talk about the succession of a president. So the succession of the president, a president is removed from office either by impeachment or they resign or they die, and the vice president would become president. But the vice president really wasn't even though everyone took the vice president will become president, they didn't have it in writing until the 25th Amendment. And the 25th Amendment was added to the Constitution, and the 25th Amendment was added not until 1967, so way later than 1789. So it basically said the vice president shall become president if anything happens to the president, if they resign, die, or impeached, from office. So before this, the powers and duties would basically say that the vice president would, but they wanted to make sure they put it into writing with the 25th Amendment. So the vice president would. But what would happen with the vice president after the vice president? So the Congress would decide the order of succession if something happened to the vice president. So after the vice president, the Congress would change this several times. In 1947, they said if something happens to the vice president, the Speaker of the House would be the next in line for president. And some said the president pro tem in the Senate would be. And some said the Secretary of State, as the Secretary of State administration to the president would be the next. So some said Speaker of the House, some said President pro tem, some said Secretary of State, or other heads in order of the creations of the heads. So into the 25th Amendment, Section 2, it says the president needs to appoint vice president if there is a vacancy. If there's a vacancy and the vice president dies, they need to put someone in there right away, right? And this has to be approved by both houses. So when a president appoints a vice president, he just can't appoint him. The House, both Senate and the House have to approve. And so, but this is very rare that a vice president would be vacant. Through history, it hasn't happened very many times, a couple times. So here's some vice presidents here that became president. So here we have, we have by election, John Adams became president, Thomas Jefferson, Martin Van Buren, Theodore Roosevelt, these became president. By the death of a president, basically John Tyler became president when the president, William Henry Harrison, he got pneumonia, 6 weeks, was dead, and John Tyler became president. Zachary Taylor, it says heat stroke. Some people think he was poisoned. Anyway, his vice president, Millard Fillmore, became president. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. James A. Garfield was assassinated. Chester Arthur became president. William McKinley was assassinated. Theodore Roosevelt became president as vice president. Warren G. Harding, undetermined illness, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, became president. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had a stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage, and his vice president was Harry S. Truman. John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took over. So it says Gerald Ford, who had been appointed to the vice presidency upon the resignation of Spiro T. Agnew, became president when Richard Nixon resigned from office. He was the only one, basically, that he became vice president, and then he became president. So I don't know what we have in brief by election here, but we have those who became president because of the president either dying or resigning. In these cases, the president was by death. So let's talk about the compensation for the presidents. How much money do they make? So their salary is fixed by Congress, who pays them. Basically, it's fixed by Congress, the government pays them. And it cannot be increased or decreased during their term. They can't say they want more money after they become president. In 1789, George Washington made $25,000 a year, which was quite a bit. Today, a president makes $400,000 a year and has annual expenses of $50,000. The income is taxable, but their expenses are non-taxable. So they also have travel allowances. So extra benefits. Let's go on to this next page. It tells more about extra benefits here. So extra benefits. Congress forbids any other emolument or wage from the United States besides what they get as their annual fixed salary. So, but they can live in the White House, the resident, and they can have a large staff at their disposal whenever. Transportation, they can fly in the jets and the automobiles and helicopters, all presidential. And they can have the use of Camp David, a mountain retreat place in Maryland where they can go as a resort. So other benefits are extended to former presidents too. So after they leave the office, they get a pension of $199,700 a year. So they get their pension and their office space. They can still have their office space and free mailing, expense account, and 30 months they can have their annual pension for specific funds to help, or 30 months of special funds to help them transition into their private life. Their pension actually is stated at $199,700 a year, so it's quite a good pension but considering they're president of the United States. So let's talk about the vice president here. What are the duties of the vice president? You'll need to know that there's two duties of the vice president. First, the vice president presides over the Senate. So the vice president is the president of the Senate. The vice president also helps to determine when a president is unable to carry out his responsibilities. If a president cannot carry out his responsibilities in some reason, then maybe health reasons or maybe mental breakdowns or whatever, the vice president will take over their job. So those are the two. First, to preside over the Senate, and the other to preside and determine when the president is unable to carry out his responsibilities. The 12th Amendment basically says the vice president has to meet the same qualifications as a president because they might become president. So the provision for a vacancy of office, the vice president has been vacant 18 times in American history. 9 presidents have been succeeded by vice presidents, and two have resigned. A president and a vice president have resigned, which were basically Nixon and Agnew both resigned. So the president has been vacant like 18 times in history. And the 25th Amendment in 1967 designated the vice president to take over that office if the president's office was vacant. So here we have this guy. Here he is, a picture, Gerald Ford. President Gerald Ford was the first person to become vice president by being nominated by President Nixon and then approved by Congress. Ford became the president after Nixon resigned. Ford was the president that had never been voted for. No one voted for him. First of all, he was voted to be a vice president because Agnew, Nixon's vice president, resigned, and then he was voted to be president because Nixon resigned. So he ended up being. It says the first Gerald Ford of Michigan was the first person to become vice president by being nominated by the president and approved by Congress. Ironically, when Richard Nixon resigned from president in 1974, Gerald Ford became president, making him the first president in American history who was not elected to the office. Ford, now having vacated the vice president to take the presidency, had to choose a vice president. He chose Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York. So the 25th Amendment affected Gerald Ford 3 times. First, when he was nominated to be vice president. Second, when he became president on the resignation of Richard Nixon. And third, when he chose a vice president to replace him. So he really leaned on that 25th Amendment, didn't he? First, when he became nominated vice president, was because of the 25th Amendment. When he became president, it was because of the 25th Amendment. And when he chose a vice president, of course he chose Rockefeller. So, but since then, vice presidents have taken a more active role than in the past. Before, it was thinking the president, the vice president had little prestige. He was like a spare part in case something happened to the president. But nowadays, the story goes different, and it actually kind of turning point with Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was a vice president. He ended up being a president when when Harding died, and he was the first one. Calvin Coolidge attended all the cabinet meetings and everything. He knew what was going on. Also, even back with John Adams, when John Adams was vice president of George Washington, he said, "I'm really nothing as vice president, but I may become everything as president." So they were basically saying a vice president needs to be prepared to be president. Eisenhower also gave vice presidents more responsibilities too. He was another one, even as vice president, that actually took a lot of responsibility. So I'm going to go ahead, we're going to go over the review, and then I want to go over, let's see, I want to actually go over a couple presidents here that were written in your book that I think you need to know about. You probably already do know about them, but let's go over this review really quick. How long is a presidential term? You got that? 4 years, right? What limitations does the 22nd Amendment place on the president's tenure? So basically the 22nd Amendment said that the president could only have 2 terms in office, not like FDR had 4 terms. You could only have 2 terms in office. So list the 3 constitutional qualifications for a president. They have to be a natural born citizen, they have to be at least 35 years old, and they have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. Number 3, which amendment states that under certain circumstances, in particular the death or resignation of a president, the vice president shall become president? The 25th Amendment for that one. Number 4, what is the order for presidential succession? The order for presidential succession, the vice president, and later on the order would be for the Speaker of the House, the President pro tempore, or the Secretary of State. But basically the order is vice president. So number 5, who determines the president's salary? Congress does. Also, let's see, where is he? What benefits and compensations does the president receive? He basically has the use of the White House. He has travel expenses. He has a staff. He has transportation, on jets and helicopters and automobiles. He has the use of Camp David as a retreat. All these things. And he even gets a pension when he leaves. So, what are the 2 official duties of the vice president? Number 1, to preside over the Senate. Number 2, to determine when a president is unable to carry out the president's responsibility as acting president. Those 2 things. So, now let's go back. I'm going to go back and we're going to go over what was written on 2 different presidents here, and I think it's kind of important that we know. Alrighty. Having a hard time here with them. It's taking so long. I'm going to talk about George Washington. Let's talk about George Washington first here. So, George Washington. George Washington, the father of his country. So we need to know, you can read a book on George Washington, that's for sure, many books. And he wrote a lot, a lot of his writings. He lived 1732 to 1799. At his eulogy, said that he was first in war and first in peace and first in the hearts of countrymen. Henry Lee wrote that about him. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of countrymen. He brought forth the victory of our War of Independence. He was our chief general. He was the chief of our Continental Army at that time. In fact, beginning in the Infant Republic, he had three capacities. First, he was commander-in-chief of our Continental Army and brought forth a victory. He also was the chairman of our Constitutional Convention, presiding over our Constitution when they penned our Constitution, which enabled 55 delegates to draft this most amazing Constitution, which replaced the Articles of the Confederation. And he also was the first president of our new nation, the first president of the United States of America. And he was very necessary in the times of the troubled years during this time. So, a little bit about George Washington, that he was the first of 6 children. It was his father's second marriage, and his father's untimely death was when George Washington was only 11. And so he was a ward of his eldest brother, Lawrence. And the eldest brother raised him at that point. And Lawrence died in Washington when Lawrence died when George Washington was only 20 years old. And he acquired Lawrence's estate, which was Mount Vernon. George Washington became a skillful surveyor and planter and an officer in the Virginia militia, a special envoy of the British general of Edward Braddock. So this is before America. During the time he stood again in the French and Indian War. He stood up against the French at that time. The French and Indian, they were attacking. George Washington was a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. So you think of George Washington, you always think of Virginia. All this time he was only like in his 20s. So, here we go again. So we go. Kind of tells about him here. So he was during this time only his 20. He fought in the War of Independence and commander-in-chief. He had great military skill and very devoted to his duty, and to those that he was in command of. He kept the American forces from disintegrating many times, and that was like 8 years of conflict, and he held together his army, or the army, I should say, during really harsh times. His crowning achievement was the victory over Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown in October of 1781. The British troops then surrendered 8,000 troops. 8,000 troops to him, virtually surrendering during the war. His greatest desire was to retire with his family onto his plantation at Mount Vernon. But his concern, he was very concerned with America, so he had to re-enter public life. And that's when he was elected unanimously chairman of the Constitution Convention at that point, and helped draft the new Constitution. He was the nation's first president. He was elected president unanimously. They unanimously chose George Washington for the first president of the United States. After retiring from public life, he served 2 terms, His last term, he spent the remaining 3 years of his life at Mount Vernon, only 3 years. In 1799, he died. He had, I think he had, basically had strep throat, or bad strep throat, and they ended up, at that time, they'd use bleed people for strep throat. Anyway, made him even worse. He ended up dying. He was mourned by all. Of course, we heard his great eulogy: first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of the countrymen. He's the father of our country. His character and moral character was very high. Very religious man, and he thought religion was necessary for morality, and basically thought spirituality, basically he was a Christian, born in his heart, born again Christian. So he was devoted to duty. His ruling principle was a total devotion. He had much power of self-control too. He brought both gravity and dignity to the nation's highest office, as the example of other presidents to follow after him. His character and qualities and personal achievements made Washington one of the greatest Americans, and definitely one of the greatest American presidents of all time. George Washington. So, profile on our first president. Sorry, I'm taking some time with him. The second president they're going to interview is going to be Abraham Lincoln, if I can get there. Abraham Lincoln, here we go. Focus on Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. In the White House, Abe Lincoln was pacing the floor of his office. He felt more troubled than he had ever before. The fate of the Union was at stake. He felt as if he were almost alone in his concern for the outcome. Friends and aides appeared to be almost panic-stricken. Abe felt that this was the most critical hour of the war, perhaps the most critical hour in the entire history of the United States. Can you imagine Abraham Lincoln at this time pacing the floor? In desperation, he left his office, went into his room, and locked the door. There he fell before a chair. With his head in his hands, he wept and prayed. Now, more than any other time in his life, he turned to God. In deep anguish, he told God that he had done all that he could. He pleaded for help, pleaded with God. There was nothing more that he could do. He must leave the result of the battle in the hands of God. He now knew that if his country was to be saved, it would be only because God willed it. It was a heartbreaking hour of prayer. When he unlocked the door, came out of his room, he felt that a great burden had suddenly been rolled off his shoulders. His intense anxiety and torturing concern had been relieved. He felt quiet and calm trustfulness. On his desk was a copy of the new Thanksgiving proclamation. He had proclaimed the last Thursday in November as a day of national Thanksgiving. The nation had never before had such an annual Thanksgiving Day, and he had decided that it was time the nation remembered in a special day what God had done. Now he read slowly the proclamation. We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace, and we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. We have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. Tears slipped down his cheeks as he read these words, for he believed in them deeply. It was because of this belief that he ordered the Treasury Department to engrave the words "In God We Trust" on the American coins. As he was sitting at the desk thinking about these things, an aide rushed in and excitingly exclaimed, "There's good news from the battle at Gettysburg, sir." In spite of this great victory, Lincoln's days were filled with dealing with generals, listening to the problems of many citizens, and handing endless administrative details. For help he turned to God through the Bible and in prayer. For help he turned to God. Almost daily now, he felt the need to go to his room to pray. More and more he became conscious of the work of God in the affairs of men. Writing to a friend, Brian Sutherland, one day he said, "I believe we are all agents and instruments of divine providence. I hold myself in my present position and with authority invested in me as an instrument of providence. I am conscious every moment that all I am and all that I have are subject to the control of a higher power, and that power can use me or not use me in any manner at any time as in his wisdom might be pleasing to him." One day, Mr. Chittenden, the Register of the Treasurer, asked him if he believed that God actually directed national affairs. With a deep feeling of emotion, Lincoln replied, "That the Almighty does make use of human agencies and directly intervenes in the human affairs is one of the plainest statements of the Bible. I have many evidence of his direction, many instances when I have been controlled by some other power than my own will, that I cannot doubt that this power comes from above." I had to read this to you. I'm going over this because, his words basically right before the battle of Gettysburg, and even coming in for the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln was a changed man. He had now, after this time, on his face in prayer, that he had been born of the Spirit. I should say, totally given his life to the Lord, and realizing it was God that was guiding him every bit of the way. You see Lincoln, you see this change in his heart in the midst. Can you imagine the turmoil he had as represented the United States of America during the hardest time of our history, during the Civil War? And Lincoln's basically saying that his providence, whenever you see the word providence means his belief in God. Providence is God guiding him, that he believed in that with all of his heart. And the Gettysburg Address, you can read that later, that he wrote, is a memorial of his heart turns towards God.